Greetings, welcome to Morgan's Variety. This is episode 8 of the Podmasters series. In this installment, we chat with Mark Coffin. He is the host of 2 podcasts, Govern Yourself Accordingly and Off Script. Both of these shows delve into political issues, particularly those that are relevant in Nova Scotia, Canada. He shares his experiences as the producer and host of the shows, and his opinions on the medium itself. Thank you for joining us. I happen to also be from Nova Scotia myself. I'm from Amherst. Where are you from?
Oh, okay. I actually spent 5 years going to school in Amherst when I was in elementary school. So, but my parents and my family is all from Cape Breton, so that was home, but now I live on the south shore of Nova Scotia.
And, alright, have you ever been involved in traditional broadcasting there in Nova Scotia before you got into the podcasting?
No, not at all. I've done a lot of interviews on the other side of the microphone as a spokesperson for things, but never as, never the creator.
And I noticed there's not a lot of Nova Scotia-related podcasts out there. What inspired you to start your podcast?
You're talking about off script, yeah?
Yes, that's right.
Yeah. I only asked because I work on a couple other ones as well. So it wasn't actually podcasting that we arrived at first. So I was working with another person that's interested in politics and interested in studying politics. Her name is Louise Cockrum, and we had seen this book that was published by an organization in Toronto called Samara, who had done 65, I think, former interviews with former members of Parliament. And we said that would be a cool project to do with former Nova Scotia MLAs that had served in Province House. So we were, trying to think of what can we do that is different and what can we do that's not a book, and we didn't want to write a book. And we didn't want to just produce research papers that would end up on our website that few people would ever read. And we said, well, we're going to be going down and sitting down with these people anyway, so let's get a good quality mic, let's learn how to use the gear, and then hopefully reach more people than we would with just a written report. So that was where it started for us. The first season of the podcast is dedicated to just the story of a former MLA, as told from the moment they decided to run, or they were sort of thinking about running, to the end of their career in politics. And then once we committed to podcasting, we had to finish the job, and it ended up being a 20-episode season. So once I was that invested in learning how to do podcasting, we kind of kept going.
And what would you say, both in terms of being someone who works on a podcast and also someone who listens to them, what do you find podcasting has to offer that you don't typically find in terrestrial radio?
Terrestrial radio, I like that term. It's on demand by default, I think. I don't know if you listen to the podcast Canada Land, but on their very first episode, they were interviewing Michael Enright, the old CBC Sunday Edition guy, and he's current, but he's quite old. And they were explaining podcasting to him, or the host Jesse Brown was explaining podcasting to him, and he said it's like radio that people listen to on purpose. And I thought that was the perfect way of capturing it. So you're not getting probably as many people, but you're getting people that actually want to listen, so the connection with the audience is there in a more intimate way. I also love my CBC too, so I enjoy the programs I can catch, but some of them don't get rebroadcast as podcasts, like the morning show in Nova Scotia. You might get a couple clips, but you won't get the full 3 hours. So I think it's just nice to have the convenience and the fact that people are there on purpose.
Do you think podcasting will one day become competitive with terrestrial and satellite radio to the point where it may surpass those mediums in popularity and profitability?
That's a good question. One thing that I have a hard time putting my finger on is just the market for podcasting, and I feel like whatever skills I might have in making a podcast, I probably lack in being able to figure out how to distribute it and how to get people who would be interested in actually listening to it. This is a difficult medium to advertise, and I know I've read people, even like the Gimlet studio folks, accept that it's just a really hard. It's hard to say how to get people to listen to a show. So I think that is a downside for it, and I'm not sure about eclipsing terrestrial media. I just don't know, and I feel like that's an industry that just has. When you're on the edge of something or part of something new, like podcasting, which is still like relatively new, and it sounds like you're familiar with the numbers for both formats. I feel like it'd be easy to think of like, oh, this is the way of the future, and like neglect to recognize that like the mainstream media or terrestrial media is still like the dominant player in the market. So, I feel like there may come a point in the future when that happens, but long-winded answer that ends up at I'm not really sure.
All right. What kind of podcast do you tend to gravitate towards as a listener?
I think I kind of like all types. Like I really enjoy like a well-produced podcast where you can tell that it's not just two guys sitting down in a studio talking to one another or two people. Having done the produced version of the podcast, I have a lot more appreciation for when you hear a quality podcast, like the amount of work that went into that. So I like that because I feel like it's something that's sort of like kind of very intentionally catered. And then I go in the complete opposite direction, and then probably half of the podcasts I listen to are just podcasts with two people who are, have a good stage energy or a good studio energy, and they just talk about a new thing every time. That's kind of, I'm all over the map, but I do like, and I kind of like the ones that where you know what to expect. So there's one that I listen to called The West Wing Weekly, and the idea is they're going back through the old episodes of The West Wing, the TV show, and just reviewing one episode per week. And you always know what to get, and you can like do a little bit of homework. And I love the television show, so I get to rewatch it and I'll listen to them talk about it and unpack sort of behind the scenes sort of stuff. Quite all over the map.
And there's currently little to no censorship on podcasts since it's distributed into the internet. It's the Wild West. That means there's a potential for people like white supremacists to have their own podcasts. Do you think there should be some censorship, or do you think it's even possible, or is it necessary?
I haven't given too much thought to that. I think one of the things that I think is, I don't know if this makes it more good or less good, but I think the fact that there have been deplatforming efforts, they have generally seemed to work out. I think anything that's got hate and discriminatory language or ideas or is pushing people to move in that direction isn't a good thing to be producing, and it should be taken down. I think the only reason I hesitate is because I think there is a bit of a line that the contemporary culture hasn't figured out where it's appropriate to draw that line yet. So I think the fact that we don't have a government regulator telling us what we can and can't say, or like taking our license or tower away, doesn't necessarily mean that it's going to be the worst possible experience. Like that also liberates a lot of room for creatives who don't want to adhere to the more absurd regulator expectations as well. So I think it's just figuring out what that balance is. And again, not an issue I've put a ton of thought into.
Sure. And if you had the choice, all things being equal, between producing a podcast and producing a show on traditional radio, if you could have the same size of audience and same budget and so on, which one would you choose?
The budget for our show was next to nothing. We had donors. So I shouldn't say next to nothing. We had probably a dozen or so loyal donors that gave us $5 and $10, $25 a month to listen to the show. But it still wasn't anything close to what we needed to actually pay ourselves to produce the show. So I think if I'm not getting paid, then I'm going to default to the platform with the most reach. For the time being, if I could figure out how to get more people listening and how to get more people donating, or if there was some secret source of revenue that I hadn't discovered, I think I would probably stick with podcasting, because you have a lot more independence over the medium.
Sure. And what challenges have you faced as you've built your podcast audience? You mentioned that marketing is a tricky thing. Are there any other factors that have come into play with that made it difficult to raise awareness about the show?
Well, I would say it just was difficult to raise awareness about the show. It's, when you're creating a podcast, I think you're creating something that will only work if you can change people's habits in a small way. You're asking for maybe 30 to 40 or 50 minutes a week of somebody's time. And I think it's, creators, we think of it as, well, they're going to listen to the podcast when they would be doing something anyways. Like, they'll listen to it while they're doing the laundry or the dishes or in the car. Like, we're not necessarily asking them to, we could just be asking them to turn off the radio they're not really listening to and actually listen to something they're enjoying. But yeah, I would just say that it's hard work to get people listening. And I don't think we mastered it yet. But I think the one thing I would say was a learning is that when we were producing episodes most regularly, we were more reliable for our listeners. That was when, we saw our numbers perform better, and taking time off, it's sort of there's some tension there, because on the one hand, you want to take the time it takes to produce good quality content, and you don't want to put garbage in your listeners' ears, but you also need to be there with relatively high frequency in order for them to develop the habit of listening to you, and in order for them to want to listen to you, you've got to be producing good content. So I think it's just something that you really need to, I guess, find the perfect balance for. And I think some podcasts do that really well by just, saying they're not necessarily trying to deliver, the gospel, but instead trying to deliver sort of the process by which you get to understand the gospel, I guess, to complete the metaphor there in a bit of an imperfect way. But I think, so when I'm thinking about the podcasts we will make going forward, I'm thinking like, okay, how can I, instead of deliver a complete package for the listener, how can I just document my own learning journey? So if I want to learn about, for instance, right now, one of the things I'm fascinated about is like, what things do we need to change the system for in politics to make it work better for people? And what things do we need to change the behavior of citizens and leaders around? And I see that as like we need both. We need system change, and we need people to change the way they're approaching our systems. But figuring out where and what, I just think that would be an interesting journey to take listeners on at some point around, instead of us saying, well, here's the list of things that people need to do better, here's the list of things that need to change in the system. It could be more of an everyday tension that just shows up on every episode. It's like, oh yeah, and here's what we're learning, and here's some things to consider, and then people can draw their own conclusions. So I think it's probably the direction that media is going, is that people want to feel empowered to draw their own conclusions more than just be fed the news. I think podcasting creates a medium where it's possible to do that.
That is true. It does accommodate certain niches. Like, for instance, I haven't lived in the Maritimes for 30 years now, but one thing I'm still cognitive of, and it hasn't changed actually with the new forms of media, is that Nova Scotia is still relatively invisible within the Canadian media landscape. If you live outside Nova Scotia, you just don't hear about it that much. So have you found your audience is receptive to what you do, in the sense that, thank God, someone's really going into depth about issues that affect me as a citizen of Nova Scotia?
Well, I don't know if I would characterize it that way. I think we do have quite a niche of people that are, and when I say quite a niche, I mean like it's a small subset of people interested in politics that are interested in what we're doing. And I wouldn't necessarily say that anyone has said what you just said about what we're doing, but I compare it to, I guess, other other work that I've done in trying to educate people about what's happening in politics. So if we host an event and it's free, or even if there's a small fee, it's a huge success if we get 100 people out. And, writing something that's going to appear on our blog or on our Facebook page, if it reaches 500 people, that's big. But we're only getting them for like 10 seconds and then they're on to the next thing. But what I've found about podcasting is that the people who have come back with feedback about what we've done, oftentimes it's a deeper level of feedback than we would get in any of those other mediums, and we're reaching a larger number of people than we would if we're bringing people in a room together. So I compare it to that. So one story that pops up as a for instance is one of our interviews was with a man named Mark Parent, who was the former environment minister for Nova Scotia, but before that he was a church minister. And that single episode, where it was just a slightly edited version of the interview we had with him in his living room, is one that I've gotten more feedback from people of a bunch of different parties through the Conservatives, but everybody found a way to work with him. I got feedback from a lot of current politicians from multiple parties, basically saying that that changed the way I think about environmental policy, or that changed the way I think about how we do or do not cooperate on issues in the legislature. So I'm just going to pause for a second with some noise coming by. But so it was a very interesting piece of feedback, and even got mentioned in, if you look, or you wouldn't want to probably, but if you look in the Hansard, like the verbal record of what happened in the legislature, that episode was referenced by one of the Halifax MLAs from different parties of his than his, and so I think it's things like that I think it was able to, we were able to reach more people, and as far as I can tell, provoke a deeper level of learning than we would have had we, just turned it into an article maybe, or turned it into, what other way we could communicate what was communicated in that interview. But it was a kind of a valuable takeaway for me that, when you're not getting paid a ton to do it, or when you're doing it on no budget or break-even budget, it kind of makes it a bit more worth it on the creator side.
Yeah, for sure, when it starts to expand beyond the parameters of just the internet.
Yeah.
Well, I thank you very much for your time today, Mark. I appreciate it.
Cool. Well, I appreciate you reaching out to chat, and I look forward to seeing what comes out there.
All right. Take care, man.
All right. Thanks, Morgan. See ya.
Yeah. Bye-bye.
Bye.